And I'm not talking about the people that have been convicted and sentenced. They are incarcerated as well. I'm talking about the pretrial detainees. There's another word for those people, innocent people. They have not been found guilty yet. They just can't afford their bail, or have been held on dangerousness, but have not been found guilty of the crime that they're being held on. We've seen an uptick in urgency. I'm proud I'm one of them, of district attorneys saying, we got to move expeditiously to try to see if we can get pretrial detainees out so that they don't go to the place where they could contract COVID at a significantly higher rate.
This week, we'll be looking at legal aspects, and I am thrilled to have an all-star panel with us. We have with us Suffolk County DA Rachael Rollins, Shannon Liss-Riordan, who is one of the nation's top plaintiff class action attorneys. We have Mark Martinez, who is a budget and policy advisor for State Senator Jalen and also the co-founder of Beacon Block. And this fabulous panel will be moderated by our very own Renée Landers, who is a professor at Suffolk University Law School. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn over the discussion to Renée. Renée, please, you have the floor.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and with such a distinguished panel of participants to talk about some of these legal issues that are affected by the COVID pandemic has brought upon us. Some of the issues have been with us for a long time. Issues of disparity, lack of access, and very different life courses have been with us for a long time. Others are unique to the pandemic and to other kinds of public health crises that our nation has encountered in the past. Issues of privacy, issues of access to services during crisis moments, and what happens when people's lives and their work lives, their access to their typical resources are disrupted. What are the legal remedies that we can offer in those respects? And so I'm really pleased that we have such a well-positioned panel to discuss some of these issues. During the pandemic, I want to go with to District Attorney Rachael Rollins first to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has overlapped with a new and reawakened focus on some of the disparities in the criminal justice system with the George Floyd killing recently, and which has spawned a lot of demonstrations around the country, including in our city, and then this is an overlay on what I've been reading has been a recent uptick in criminal activity throughout the course of the pandemic, perhaps because many buildings and locations are empty, people are off the streets, perhaps because of people's economic circumstances during the pandemic, their situations have markedly changed, and perhaps that has led to some crime. And also perhaps there are bad actors using the pandemic to just sort of cover as cover for the kinds of criminal activities that they would engage in their ordinary course. So District Attorney Rollins, I want to know what your perspective is on some of these issues and what kinds of things your office is thinking about in terms of a response.
Sure. So thank you for allowing me to be involved in this discussion. What we're seeing, I think, is sort of dual pandemics happening. We have COVID-19, and now with the murder of not only George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Tony McDade. We don't have enough time to go through all of the names, including which were not at the hands of the police but have not been solved. Massive uptick in Black trans women being murdered across the country. We are seeing sort of that these disparities are exacerbated, right? Even though COVID-19 does not discriminate, anyone can be impacted. What we are seeing is that the very same communities that seem to be failed systemically in so many other ways are bearing the brunt of the burden with respect to COVID-19. Direct example of that, of the 351 or so towns and cities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Chelsea, Massachusetts is #1 with respect to positives frequently. Chelsea is part of Suffolk County, over 60% Latinx community, very vibrant and strong immigrant community, but is languishing, I would say, with respect to a lot of the positives, positive COVID-19 test results that we have seen there. Similarly, when we are ordered to shelter in place, essentially remain either 6 to 10 feet away from people, not be in groups of bigger than 25 in some circumstances, and some other people saying 10, we have seen that many of the silenced communities, so the incarcerated, and I'm not talking about the people that have been convicted and sentenced, they are incarcerated as well. I'm talking about the pretrial detainees. There's another word for those people, innocent people. They have not been found guilty yet. They just can't afford their bail or have been held on dangerousness, but have not been found guilty of the crime that they're being held on. We've seen an uptick in urgency. I'm proud, I'm one of them, of district attorneys saying, we got to move expeditiously to try to see if we can get pretrial detainees out so that they don't go to the place where they could contract COVID at a significantly higher rate. Because two things, about 2-3 months ago, there was the top 10 places in the United States that were hotspots of COVID-19. 8 of them were carceral facilities. #1 and #2 were in Ohio. And additionally, we are seeing that, these very communities that don't often have a voice are the ones that are being, harmed, right? So when you go to prison, which I hope none of you ever do, or jail, you cannot, if you are in a cell with somebody else, you can't be 6 feet apart. Certainly when you're sleeping, you can't be. And then most of these cells have an open toilet, no lid, right in the middle of the cell. So the very things we're supposed to be doing to remain in good hygiene, et cetera, you are incapable of doing. So we're looking at issues like that, Renee, not just in my office where, I think the state of emergency was issued March 10th. On the 12th, we had already gone to a reduced workforce. We had 4 different teams that were going to rotate into our municipal and district courts. We did that before the trial court issued any of its orders, before the governor made any determinations. We are leading and not following, and then we're really proud that we have had 2 grand juries up and running during this global pandemic. The first one we had in May, and we were one of like a handful in the country that had them. So we're adapting really quickly to these problems, but they are hitting our systems really hard.
Right, so you raised a lot of good points there. You pointed out a lot of issues that are kind of invisible to the general public. The problem of the pretrial detainees, and then just when the courts are operating at kind of limited capacity, the ability to actually, have those bail hearings, to really address some of these concerns that you raised in your comments are really and truly exacerbated. One aspect that you didn't address, I've also been reading about concerns about increased domestic violence because of the inability of people, to leave and to be seen in public and to, have, the protections that sort of transparency might afford them. Have you seen that in the statistics in your office and in, some of the cases that you've been called upon to handle?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, there has been an uptick in domestic violence. Oftentimes work is a respite for individuals that are being harmed in their home. We have seen, unfortunately, the numbers plummet with respect to child abuse matters that my office handles, and we know that is not true. Many times school is the place where children find a respite, right? So what we have seen, Renee, is the fact that, if I go to school as a 5th grader, 3rd grader, 7th grader, and you are my guidance counselor or teacher, you're a mandated reporter. You know what my affect is normally like. You see me every single day during the school year. And so you can tell, I'm not just talking about the physical manifestations of harm, but if there's neglect, if there's, you know, I am sleep deprived, right? I am agitated. I am acting out in some way. We need to be much better at making sure we're educating people, because even though our mayors have done a great job about giving young people the Chromebooks to Zoom into their class, the Globe recently said over 20% of the children in the Boston Public Schools haven't even logged into their Zoom, their Chromebook that they were given. Renee, all of this intersects with each other. Many of those students, I guarantee you, their parents are the new essential workers, right? We've always known police, fire, and first responders are essential, but now we know that people that work in supermarkets and food distribution centers, transportation and sanitation and hospitals, they are our essential personnel now. They don't get the privilege of Zooming into work. They have to physically show up, right? Zoom is a privilege. And so they also have to homeschool their children. Many of their children, not all, but might be on an IEP or be English language learners. So the gap that we have in our educational system is widening every day with this global pandemic. And then all of those same things, Renee, are drivers for crime, right? So yes, you're right. There are people that are just going to harm whether there's a global pandemic or not. Yes, you're right. There are people that are going to take advantage of the pain and the rage and the anguish that our nation has been showing as a result of the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others. But there are many people that are simply trying to exist and survive in this moment and not, be evicted, right? Not lose their home due to foreclosure. They're unemployed right now, right? They have childcare responsibilities they haven't had. So it's all of those things packed together that I think we are seeing. They are stressors in and of themselves, but they are exponentially making it more of a time bomb regarding some of the crimes that we're seeing.
Right. So I think that was a very helpful catalog of, some of the conditions in the community that have been exacerbated or perhaps even caused, some of them, by the COVID-19 crisis. I just wanted to do a little bit of translation. You mentioned IEPs, individual education plans, just so that our audience was could appreciate what that means, that, students who need assistance in dealing and interacting with the school system have these individual education plans. And in ordinary course, it takes a lot of support and supervision in the home to allow any student, any one of us, to achieve. But for those students, it's particularly challenging. There are very serious concerns about the continued educational progress of Black and Brown students in the city, because of lack of access to computers, internet connections, or the parents who are able to really supervise their continued progress. I noticed I also appreciated you mentioning Chelsea, and my statistics are a little out of date, but just in the patient population in June at the Massachusetts General Hospital, about 50% of the COVID patients treated up until that point were Spanish speaking. And the usual hospital census is about 10 to 15% out of over 4,000 patients. And it's all because of these populations in Chelsea and some of the other Latinx communities that were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. You also mentioned the connection to all of these criminal justice concerns with the nature of the participation in the workforce by some of these communities in our city. People of color disproportionately are in jobs that cannot be performed on a remote basis, as you mentioned, but we consider them to be performing essential functions in hospitals, cleaning staffs, retail establishments. But our pay has not actually kept up with how we seem to value, at least abstractly, their importance. Also, I want to turn the conversation now to Shannon Liss-Riordan, who has a lot of expertise in some of these workers' rights issues. And, the pandemic, as Rachael has pointed out, has disproportionately affected workers depending on their ability to work remotely or not. And also in whether they have, they're really classified as employees or they are workers in the gig economy. And our whole support system for workers depends on that employment classification, their access to health insurance, Social Security benefits, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation. So Shannon, would you please tell us a little bit about what you're kind of seeing in the work that you do in this area?
Yes, thank you so much, Renee. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm really pleased to be here to get to talk to you about this. The pandemic that we're facing, I think, is just highlighting disparities that have been out there for so long. And I believe that the work that I've been doing has really been coming to the fore in ways that I wouldn't have predicted 6 months ago. I've spent much of the last 5-6 years representing gig economy workers around the country in claims against major corporations that are trying to upend the entire system of employment as we know it in our country. People like drivers for Uber and Lyft and Amazon and Grubhub and this whole slew of companies that call themselves the gig economy. I think people are now realizing over the last few months in a way that they haven't before what it means for these workers not to have the protections that employees have in our country that we've fought for over the course of decades. It sounds to a lot of people like an esoteric legal question whether workers are classified as independent contractors or employees, but we're seeing now so starkly that these workers are essential workers and what it means for our social fabric not to have them have employee rights. As independent contractors, they don't have even the most basic protections to be guaranteed being paid minimum wage. They don't get overtime. They're not entitled to traditional unemployment insurance if they lose their jobs, or workers' comp if they get injured on the job. And most notably, as we've realized during this pandemic, they don't even have the entitlement to paid sick leave, which we have here in Massachusetts and in other parts of the country. So I've been working for a long time to try to secure employee rights for these workers. Very pleased that recently the Attorney General of Massachusetts has joined us in this fight, as well as the Attorney General of California, because we have here in Massachusetts a particularly strong legal test for determining who's an employee and who's an independent contractor. That test, it's called an ABC test. That test was recently adopted by the state of California, which is the birthplace of so many of these gig economy companies. And it was adopted for the reason that people have recognized that these companies, these multi-billion-dollar companies, are really just getting away with not paying for all of the benefits and all of the protections that employers need to pay for their employees. I've ratcheted up the litigation that we've been doing against these companies, thinking that the fact that they're not even getting paid sick leave should make it abundantly clear that there's a problem with them not having employment rights. So I have cases that are now being actively litigated in courts in Massachusetts and in California and around the country to try to get these benefits. I think it's particularly telling that these companies have boasted how much cash they're sitting on. You've got Uber at the beginning of the pandemic talked about having, I believe, $8 billion in cash on hand. So it wasn't worried about riding out the pandemic. And Lyft said that it had a couple $1 billion in cash in hand. But meanwhile, these drivers have been in pretty desperate straits. And I think what Rachael was talking about before about the uptick in criminal activity that we're seeing is not surprising. People are being put in very desperate circumstances. Congress did step in early in this pandemic and expanded unemployment in an unprecedented way to include independent contractors for the first time. But that expanded benefit just ran out at the end of July. And now it's up in the air what's going to happen next for these workers. So I realize that what has been happening in our country has exacerbated not only economic disparities, but the racial disparities. So many of the workers in the gig economy are Black and are brown, and this is a racial issue as much as anything that we're facing in this country right now. And I think these economic issues intersect so closely with the outrage that we're seeing about how minorities are treated in this country. And I'm very hopeful that with this growing recognition, the tide may be turning. I would like to see on a national level stronger protections be made to make it easier for these workers to get their rights under the law. Right now, in what we hope are the waning months of the Trump administration, the Federal Department of Labor is moving in the opposite direction. It's trying to make it harder for misclassified independent contractors to prove their employees. I am hopeful that with the new year, we may be able to see a turn in the other direction and expand protections nationwide for these workers who we now realize are essential to the way our society is working today.
I was just reading a case the other day that was decided recently where you mentioned the Department of Labor's efforts to, implement, some of these new policies, and the Department of Labor was given some rulemaking authority to sort of classify what workers who might be eligible for paid family leave, for example, under the various pandemic relief statutes. And the Department of Labor wrote a set of rules that actually attempted to narrow the class of workers that Congress intended to include in the protections for paid leave, due to all kinds of family circumstances related to the pandemic. So it does seem that I think it was important that you raised the important role of the political actors in this, the role of the Congress in particularly in trying to kind of level the playing field around the country on some of these things. There's been a suggestion that for workers' compensation, because some of the states have had such difficulty in processing workers' compensation claims, and Massachusetts, while better than some, has had an uneven record in that regard. What do you think about the prospect of nationalizing the workers' compensation system instead of leaving it at this sort of joint federal state thing like it is now?
Well, workers' compensation has traditionally been a state function, as have the unemployment.
I meant unemployment. I said the wrong thing.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was going to talk about unemployment in particular because it is pretty extraordinary the way Congress did include unemployment in the CARES Act as the second major bill that was in response to the pandemic. And it was a good idea that had a lot of bumps in the road in how it was carried out. I mean, it was pretty historic that Congress came together to do that, to ensure a pretty generous safety net for a lot of workers who were impacted by the loss of their jobs during the pandemic. But those good intentions ran into some pretty terrible bureaucracy in a number of states where there were questions that had to be sorted out whether the state unemployment systems would be paying certain workers or the federal government would be paying them. And a court in New York actually recently ruled that Uber and Lyft drivers need to get these payments more quickly because in New York there were tremendous delays, as there have been around the country, to get these workers their unemployment benefits. So what typically happens is that employers have to provide data to state unemployment systems, which allows it to be calculated what the workers' benefits are. Because companies like Uber and Lyft don't provide that data to the states, there have been terrible delays in these workers getting their checks. And so a lot of them have been pushed into the federal system just so that they can get their checks more quickly. But basically that means that it's the federal government, meaning taxpayers, meaning all of us, are paying for those workers rather than these multi-billion-dollar companies who are sitting on their piles of cash. So I'm hoping to see more of, and I think we are starting to see more aggressive enforcement by state governments to make sure these companies are paying into these systems. But a lot of those efforts have been stymied by loose rules that do exist around the country and in most states as to who's an employee and who's an independent contractor. So I would like to see a federal system with a stronger federal law that will tighten up, like we have in Massachusetts and California, a stricter distinction between employees and independent contractors.
And also that would, require some of these companies to use some of that cash to play into these employment insurance systems to help workers in exactly this kind of situation. Before we turn to the student questions, I don't want to leave Mark Martinez out of this conversation because of his role in the State House and his role in helping to organize some of the legislative staffers in the State House, Black staffers particularly, to really try to, the legislative employees have been sort of the odd people out, along with the gig workers, and with respect to some of the protections of the employment laws. And I would call on Mark to talk a little bit about what the impetus was behind the Beacon Block organization that you and others in the State House have organized. How you think it's going and what you hope to accomplish with it. Because I think it could be an example for others who are taking sort of proactive steps to try to advocate on their own behalves in the situations where they work.
Yeah, happy to chat about that. So I think the impetus there was a lot of what Shannon and DA Rollins talked about, was, the pandemic combined with, the murder of George Floyd and too many other people to mention, Black staff not feeling supported at the State House and in any workplace is not a new thing. But what we found is, as we were having these conversations pre-COVID and pre-George Floyd about what we wanted, and then, George Floyd was murdered, and we saw legislative leaders across the country, but also inside the State House, talking about this kind of newfound dedication to uplifting Black voices and centering Black voices in conversations. And I think we just kind of looked at ourselves and decided, well, if they're listening to Black voices, then they need to be listening to the Black voices inside of the State House. Because there's not many of us, and there's lots of reasons why that is, that the State House has historically not been able to recruit or retain Black staff or other staffers of color. And one of those big reasons actually overlays with, especially with what Shannon was talking about. One of the things we talk about is the overburdened nature of constituent services for communities of color. So go to the representatives that represent communities of color, especially if they are electeds of color, and they can talk to you more about this. You can see Rep. Nika Elagardo, Rep. Liz Miranda have talked about this on Twitter plenty of times, and other Black elected officials as well, about how, all of the things that Shannon talked about the disproportionate impact on, Black and brown workers and lack of resources for those, that travels over to the State House. And for a lot of people, if you've made it to your elected official, that's generally your last resort, right? For people that come from communities of color, their first thought is very rarely ever, let me call my state senator or let me call my state rep, because that's not how I was raised in the community that I grew up in, and that's not how most people are raised. So generally by the time they get to us, we are kind of their last resort, which means that they are in more dire need. It's the same thing that if you go to hospitals, one of the big issues about why this has impacted, Latinx people in hospitals is that's also a population that generally tends to get to the hospital later on in the disease because of, lots of issues around trust or, not having access to these institutions. And so they get to us, the people from these communities get to us and generally are, in the few cases where there are staffers of color, it's generally people from these communities. So now you have staffers of color that are overburdened, that, are doing far more work than their counterparts from, majority white districts as far as constituent services, but they're not being compensated anymore. They're not getting any more help. And there's a severe lack of training in the State House across the board about how to handle these issues. So depending on who that staffer is and how much time they've spent in the building is really going to depend on, will really impact how much help these communities get and how much help these constituents are getting when they're coming to us with UI issues, unemployment issues, or coming to us with issues, surrounding labor or health insurance, getting access to any of the services, access to testing. And that's one of the many reasons and one of the many issues facing Black staffers. But I think it's the one that we talk about the most, because for the staffers of color in that building, and lots of other people too, but I think especially the staffers of color, we come to the building with the desire to help the communities that we come from, right? It's not, very rarely for us is it this kind of like a stepping stone or a way to just kind of grab more power. It's a way for us to disseminate power into the communities that we come from that normally are not empowered. And we carry a really heavy burden with that.
So it's a little bit of an early warning system on what the issues are in the community that perhaps the legislature should pay some attention to. So I think giving voice to those concerns sounds like a really good opportunity, particularly since people have said that they intend to listen in the current environment that we're in right now. I wanted to circle back to Shannon for just one more comment because of this that's related to some of the health issues that both Rachael and Mark have talked about, and the status of some of these essential workers. As the economy slowly resumes something, moving toward some semblance of normalcy, and people are encouraged or required to return to work, what do you think the sort of risk allocation ought to be in terms of, exposure to COVID in the workplace? What should be the employer's obligation? What should be the employee's obligation? Are you working on those issues at all as people, continue to return to work?
Well, we are seeing those questions come up all the time. And I do want to say, related to the fights that we've been involved in to get employee status for these workers, for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and Amazon drivers who we're all now recognizing as essential workers, I'm very worried that if these companies get permitted to continue misclassifying them as independent contractors, there's this really easy hook that companies around the country might latch onto and say, hey, you know what, we've been suffering financially and there is this work that needs to be done and we've got a great idea about how we can bring back a lot of workers. We're going to bring them all back as independent contractors. And if these major companies who clearly can afford to give employee protection to their workers are allowed to get away with that, I'm worried what it's going to mean for the future of work if other companies get to latch onto that and do the same thing. But I think there are so many questions that are being raised now about what responsibilities are for the companies that are bringing the workers back. Because for Uber and Lyft drivers, it's not possible to stay 6 feet away from your passengers as you're transporting them. For these delivery drivers, for Instacart shoppers, for Amazon delivery drivers, they're putting themselves in harm's way to do their jobs, and especially with the ending of the unemployment protections now for independent contractors, so many of them are going to have to go back into the workplace. And what the Republicans in Congress are trying to do now is, rather than grapple with the kinds of problems that I've been talking about, they're going the opposite way, and they're trying to insulate employers from any liability based on workers' exposure to COVID when they go back to work, which is directly contrary to what we need to be doing right now. As it stands right now, that it's a hard standard to sue your employer for an unsafe workplace. There are many court rulings saying you have to go through this administrative process through OSHA, which has not been very proactive in handling the crisis, hasn't even come up with comprehensive guidelines for what employers should be doing, and is massively understaffed to take on the enforcement that would be required to make sure that employers are guaranteeing a safe workplace.
So I think
the opposite direction.
And if
Yeah,
I
no.
could, Renee, can I just add regarding crimes, right? If anyone's been reading the New York Times over the last few months, we saw the juxtaposed two photos in New York of like a police officer molly-whopping some brown man for not having a mask on, literally like flinging him to the ground, as juxtaposed to some, you know, I don't know, Brooklyn gentrified neighborhood of white people sitting in a park with police officers like nicely handing them masks and asking them to. Like, if this were random, then Black people would occasionally win. So it's not random. All of this is systemic and planned, and we are losing. Poor people are losing, and poor people of all colors. And then Black and brown people are losing as well. So the way that we are criminalizing behavior, right? When we see juxtaposed, you know, white men with assault rifles marching into whatever state capital that they have in whatever town that is, and then Black men with a license to carry are being killed by the police. Like, the Second Amendment applies to us as well. So I will add, though, with respect to immigrants, there is a terror, not just a fear, a terror of going to the hospital that they'll be reported to ICE and deported. And that does nothing to keep us safe, right? What we want to do is actually encourage people to go and say, I need help, instead of going back to their restaurant or somewhere else. And they're also very fearful, Renee and Chelsea, of being evicted, right? Because many of the housing situations in these immigrant communities, and I'm the product of immigrants, is you would be shocked to learn that a 3-bedroom apartment in Chelsea, each bedroom may have an entire family in that room, and they are not allowed to use the kitchen. Like, there are just conditions you couldn't even imagine that are very commonplace in those circumstances.
So I think these are all really excellent points that that overlap with the workplace situations, and then what people are able to do, you know, to organize their lives and to live in safe workplaces, and also to we can have a whole program probably on the issues around wearing masks and how to enforce wearing masks and that sort of thing at some future time. But right now, it's time to go to our student questions. So Rachael and Shannon and Mark will have continued opportunities to answer questions and to bring up additional information that's very important to this conversation. And the person who's going to moderate the student question part of this program is Arjun Singh, who's a producer for the show Boston Public Radio at WGBH News. So I'm going to turn the program over to Arjun right now.
Thank you so much, Professor Landers. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. As Professor Landers said, first we'll hear from 4 different students over here at Suffolk, and then we'll turn it over to you guys. If we are not able to get to all of your questions, which we possibly won't be able to today, our professors are working to answer all of them. So feel free to ask away, keep asking them, but if you don't hear from me, hopefully your question will be answered. Well, you know, while our students are getting ready, DA Rollins, there were a lot of great points that I think you brought up. And one of the things that I've seen talked about a lot is the lack of a right to counsel in many situations. You know, it does apply, I believe, in the criminal justice system. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But especially, you know, in some of the issues that Shannon was bringing up, workplace issues, when you're dealing with insurance companies, you don't have a right to have a lawyer by your side. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what can that do when reforms are being put in front of us? The laws are changed, but you don't have access to a lawyer and you have to handle all of these situations yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, Arjun, you do have a right to counsel in criminal matters, which is good. But I will say, you know, there are some things that I think DCF, the Department of Children and Families, is the closest thing to a criminal matter to me, because they can take away your children. You're entitled to counsel even if you can't afford counsel. You are given counsel in a DCF proceeding. If there's, for example, a 51A filed against you and they're going to look at, you know, abuse or neglect of your child and possibly take them away. But when you're getting evicted, you're not necessarily entitled to a lawyer. There's been a lot of movement with respect to all the great things that excellent lawyers like Shannon, who don't, who do huge class action lawsuits, but are experts in sort of individualized cases as well. There are so many decisions if you're a non-unionized worker, for example, right? And you don't have a Weingarten right, it's called, if you are in a unionized workforce, to say, look, it's not my personal lawyer, but can I have a union representative sitting in front of me so it's just not me alone in this, in a meeting where I don't have nearly as much power as an employee as maybe management might. So I think you're right. We need to look at changing that with respect to legislation. I think additionally, one of the things that is terrifying, a lot of these ICE arrests that are happening, they are not criminal arrests by ICE. They are civil arrests for a civil infraction of a federal sort of administrative agency. So when ICE went into courthouses and maybe dragged me literally out of a courthouse, 5 plainclothes men, and put me in a car, they don't have to, if they're civilly arresting me, they don't have to bring me to an Article 3 judge in the Moakley courthouse. They don't have to bring me to a federal magistrate judge who is appointed by those Article 3 judges to answer as to what did Mr. Arjun Singh do? Why is he here right now? What is your basis, federal agent, of bringing him here? They just put you in a car and we might not see you again. You might just be deported because it's a civil arrest. So I am proud that very shortly after taking office, January 2nd, 2019, I was one of 2 DAs that sued ICE in Massachusetts, and we became the first state in the United States of America where ICE couldn't make civil arrests in courthouses, because churches, schools, hospitals, and courthouses are 4 places where people should be able to go and be honest and have the services that are supposed to be rendered to them done without fear of retribution. So I agree, there's a lot of places. There's been a big movement with our Boston Bar Association for civil representation in certain matters. If you're about to lose your job, your house, things like that, I would be a big proponent of that.
Great. And let's move on to our first student speaker of the day. This is Alfredo Serrano. He's a junior, double majoring in business administration and business analytics. Alfredo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Arjun, for having me. My question is directed to Ms. Reardon. Ms. Reardon, the question is the following. Uber and Lyft workers have been dramatically affected by COVID-19. Both have experienced an increase on the risk and a decrease on their income. The European Union has responded by implementing the COVID wage. Now, my question for you is, what's been the response in the US so far? And are these companies being actually held liable for the increase in risk and the decrease in income of these share ride drivers? If yes, how? And if not, why not?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. In the United States, there hasn't been any kind of across the board added protections for these workers who are risking themselves and their families every day when they go to work. In fact, it's really just the opposite. They've been, as I've been discussing, they are so vulnerable as they have been before, and even more so with the pandemic crisis. So there are a number of employers around the country that have voluntarily implemented hazard pay for some of these essential workers, grocery store workers in particular. But a lot of them are scaling that back. So for instance, I'm representing Whole Foods workers now who were receiving several dollars an hour in hazard pay for the first couple months of the pandemic, but then it went away. Well, the pandemic hasn't gone away, but the risks are still there. So I think that our country has really taken a different approach to the whole pandemic from Europe. And in fact, I thought that the way Europe handled things as compared to how we handled things was really quite telling. There was a real emphasis in keeping those bonds between employer and employee solid, so that when we come out of this crisis, people will have jobs to return to. in the US, however, the focus was getting people on unemployment. I mean, it was great that Congress did cover more workers in unemployment for these months under the CARES Act, but it was striking how the push was to get people off of payrolls, whereas in Europe, the push was to keep people on payrolls. And I really hope Congress takes a look at that and thinks about that as it hashes out the next bill that is going to need to come to figure out where we go from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Alfredo. Up next, we have Marie Koenberg. She's a freshman who's joining us from Stuttgart, Germany right now. Marie, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun. So my question is, to what extent does the pandemic pose a threat to human rights regarding the violation of privacy, since emergencies provide the government with a shortcut to access people's personal information?
Professor Landers, what do you think of that?
I do think that is a serious concern. So I think that I was just, looking at a question in one of the Q&As that was submitted in writing, which sort of raises a different aspect of that same issue. So the first thing I would say is that privacy, like other kinds of personal and constitutional rights, none of these rights that we have are absolute. That there are circumstances that may require us to incur reasonable restrictions on these rights. But I think that we should not too blithely give these rights away in crisis situations. I think this is one of the cases I will join Shannon in, like, jumping on some of the big tech companies and so forth, because I think this is one of those areas where they try to assure us constantly that they are, they have our privacy interests and they'll protect our privacy interests, and they actually really don't. They want our data, they want our information to be able to market to us. And I think that the government, our government in particular, I think the European Union has been much more aggressive in trying to police some of these practices. But I think our government needs to be more careful in thinking about the security of some of these tracking platforms, and really, investing in the technological infrastructures, in the human resources infrastructures to do things like contact tracing and things like that, so that there isn't this sort of like permanent computer record of, every interaction that everyone has ever had in their lives. So I do think that that is a serious concern, and that we need to be careful about striking the right balance between public health and safety and personal privacy.
Fantastic. Marie, thank you so much for your question. Up next, we have Shay Gallo. He's a sophomore who is studying business management here in Suffolk. Shay, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Arjun. My question is for Shannon. I understand that you're a huge advocate for workers' rights and equality in the workplace. On the opposite extreme, do you think that wealthy CEOs of large corporations like Amazon, Boeing, Tesla should be able to influence government policy in the interest of their own personal financial gain through lobbying? Isn't this just another form of inequity in the workplace, but more significantly, inequity in our nation?
So thank you for that. Yes, I think really more than ever now, we are seeing the effects of such enormous disparities in wealth and power. And the executives and CEOs and founders of these companies who are sitting at the top of these multi-billion-dollar empires are influencing our country in so many ways, not just the control that they have over their own workforces, but they are leveraging this power into having significant policy, putting policy pressure on lawmakers. So I feel like now more than ever, it is so crucial that workers need to be coming together in order to voice their concerns and have their concerns heard. And I think that the pandemic really is laying bare so many of these inequities. I think the fact that Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, is sitting on top of Amazon, and his net worth has multiplied in the last few months, while his workers aren't getting the benefits of our basic wage protection. So, for example, one of the cases that I've been fighting for a while involves Amazon delivery drivers who Jeff Bezos classifies as independent contractors, so they don't have to be paid their full wages. It's just, it's really outrageous. There's a big cry from employers, most notably these gig companies that are based largely on the West Coast, that have been saying that they are creating a new type of work. They're creating new opportunities for people to enjoy part-time well, they don't call it employment, but they're saying that this gig work allows workers and their families to supplement their income, and that they are really creating jobs by allowing these types of work arrangements to flourish. And I think that policy message was unfortunately getting through to a lot of people who weren't realizing what was really going on here, that these companies were really just trying to save money to the detriment of these workers. There's an enormous policy debate going on right now in California, because even though it strengthened its law, it borrowed our Massachusetts law to try to crack down on these companies who are evading their obligations. But now these companies are rolling out $100 million ballot initiative that will be on the ballot in California in November to try to upend this heightened protection for workers. And I'm just very hopeful that the collective voice of workers and their advocates is getting through, and people, voters as well as policymakers, will be understanding what's really going on here, is that allowing these companies to get away with this is just a giveaway. It's a corporate giveaway to these extremely wealthy CEOs.
Can I just add one thing to that answer? I think this is absolutely right, but I think you raise a fundamental flaw in our political system. The reliance of politicians on private campaign contributions and all the ways in which the individual limits on campaign contributions can be evaded is a serious problem in our system that actually translates into power for the leaders of these companies who have immense wealth and other people in our system. So, you know, again, I think there are models in Europe that that we could look to and think about, you know, ways in which we could limit that kind of outside influence of wealth on the political system.
Fantastic. And for our last student speaker today, joining us is Kaya Beckerman. She's a freshman who's studying political science. Kaya, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun. This question is for Rachael Rollins. In the ACLU and Prison Policy Initiative's June report evaluating the actions states have taken to protect incarcerated people and staff from COVID-19, Massachusetts received an F+ due to gross negligence. Given your role and work to reform the criminal justice system, what do you think should be done to improve the state's response? Do you think states can be held liable for the deaths of inmates or staff?
So we have, with the ACLU and a group called MACDL, Mass Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and CPCS, which are the public defenders. The defense bar sued the trial court to basically say, when COVID happened, you must get these prisoners and detainees out of prison. What I talked about earlier, because it's a place where you can't do the two things you have to in order to not contract COVID-19: remain 6 feet apart and have extreme hygiene. And so we are proud that we tried to join that lawsuit as a petitioner, meaning not a respondent. Like, we wanted, as one of the 11 DAs and prosecutors, I wanted to join the defense bar in that sense. Since COVID-19 has happened, I have worked with the defense bar to reduce the prison population in the Suffolk County House of Corrections, which is mostly people that are held pre-trial, by 35%. So we have done very incredible work, meaning 1 in 3 people that were there pre-COVID-19 are now removed and out and not in a place where they are more likely to contract COVID-19. I do believe if the Commonwealth has you in their custody and control and they fail you, or they put you in a circumstance where you are more susceptible to harm, and they are on notice, you know, essentially of the potential harm, and do nothing, yes, I do believe that they should be held accountable, very much so. And so I think, I'm not sure exactly what the F+ was in regarding, jails in particular, but, I think if people, because remember, the comorbidity factors and the underlying health conditions are what make you more susceptible potentially, according to the CDC, of contracting COVID-19. And due to, systemic problems with health and poor communities or Black and brown communities, we see more comorbidity factors in those populations. So they are more susceptible to COVID-19. So it's a long way of saying I agree. I think we should be holding our Commonwealth, our Executive Office of Public Safety. And honestly, I do hold an immunity as the district attorney, but I don't see any problem with me being held accountable too, if we are willfully, looking the other way when we know we're sending somebody into a potentially risky situation. That is why in the brief, I said, look, either don't send them to Suffolk County House of Correction, or if they can't be anywhere because they're too dangerous, they need to be not in solitary confinement, but in a place where they are not within 6 feet and they are extremely hygienic when they are there. So we've been working with sheriffs and the Executive Office of Public Safety on that.
Great. Thank you, Kai, and thank you to all of our students who joined us today on camera. Next, we're going to turn around and open up the questions to you. So to start off this section, Mark, I'd love to actually go to you on this one. Congressman Louis Gohmert tested positive for the coronavirus. It also came out in the Politico playbook that his staff was being required to come into the office, that they were being chided for wearing masks. Those stories appeared to not be uncommon within the halls of Congress. As a staffer, a professional staffer, do you think that there is extra pressure to show up to work? And is there a safe way for political staffers and staffers within the halls of a legislature to be able to speak out about these concerns?
Yeah, so obviously I can only speak for the State House. We went work from home before the federal government shut everything down. So I've been working from home since the second week of March. And there's been no pressure to go into the building. They've actually encouraged us not to go into the building unless absolutely necessary. They've equipped us with all the technology in order to be able to still access the files and documents that we need, as well as, still be able to be responsive to constituents, which is the real concern. But yeah, so all I can say is for the Massachusetts State House, there's been zero pressure to go into work, at least certainly from my office and from the Senate in general. And like I said, I've gone into the State House once since March. Quickly, it's closed to the public, so only staff can be in there anyways. And the halls were empty. There's signs everywhere about social distancing and masks and hand sanitizer everywhere. There's, limits to the number of people that can be in the elevator. So the Mass State House has done a really good job with it.
What do you make of someone like Louis Gohmert, criticizing his own staffers, pressuring them to come in amidst a pandemic?
I think it's gross. I think that there's no reason in 2020 that people have to be going into the office for certain things. Obviously, I don't work in Congress in DC, so some of their job functions may be different, but I can't imagine a possible scenario where you would need 5 people in your office physically there. It's just not safe. And I also think that, there is this kind of inherent contradiction of we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're telling people to stay home and stay safe, but you're not allowing your staff to do the same thing. I think there's a real disconnect there. And like I said, completely unnecessary.
Great. Shannon, I want to go to you with this next question, which is pertaining to something you had talked about earlier, which is, particularly the Republicans in Congress want to create limited liability, shield companies from what they say are potential frivolous lawsuits that will come because of workers feeling unsafe due to COVID-19. Is there any merit to that notion that frivolous lawsuits are being filed or will be filed if they're not shielded, if these companies are not shielded by law?
Well, I love the way these companies always oppose the kinds of lawsuits they hope not to get hit with as, quote, frivolous lawsuits. I think this is a serious concern that we're facing, as we've all been talking about this afternoon, about what life is going to look like as more people do start going back to work. And I think it's incredibly important that employers be cognizant and held accountable if their workplaces are not safe. So I think that Republicans in Congress are going in the absolute wrong direction to be focusing on shielding employers. I think the focus needs to be on enhancing protections for everyone, supporting a safety net for those workers for whom it's not safe for them to go back to work, and encouraging employers to make their workplaces as safe as possible for those employees who do need to go back and who can go back.
So can I just add that another place I saw this locally, I think in our state legislature, was originally when there were crisis standards and care guidelines for hospitals back in March and April, when there were triage teams. There was all these discussions about, well, we'll look at comorbidity factors or life expectancy, which, if the hair on the back of your neck doesn't stand up when you hear words like that regarding, if you ride the #1 bus from beginning to end, your life expectancy decreases by decades, right, as you move into browner and browner neighborhoods. And then they were going to absolve the triage team, which of course wouldn't have people of different languages or abilities, or, and I'm talking about people with disabilities who are terrified of all colors, to say, is my life valued, right? Am I not going to get a respirator because you look at me as less than a person? And then the legislature was contemplating no liability whatsoever if you die as a result of one of these decisions. Who are the people that are going to be left holding all of the, financial burden of this death, not to mention the trauma and emotional harm as a result of that, with decisions that are being made? So, we have to be so much more deliberate about looking to see who is making these decisions and who the decisions they are making impact, and having a voice there. Because I will end with, what poor people don't have a lot of? Time. So we don't have time to go and sit at a city council meeting for 8 hours to wait to have our time to say we don't think this is fair. We're your essential workers who are also homeschooling our children and learning the English language, possibly, as a second or third language of ours, showing how brilliant we truly are, right? We don't have time to sit there and to lobby or negotiate. We just want to be treated with dignity and respect and fairly. And we want our legislators, irrespective of their color and background, to value us enough so that we don't have to do their job in addition to all the other jobs we're doing right now.
District Attorney Rollins, sort of on that point, do you think that these inequities are given credence in the judicial system? One thing that comes to mind when you were talking is there's a potential $300 fine if you don't have a mask. But for a lot of people, even something like a mask can be financially out of reach, or it can be difficult to obtain. In prosecution, sentencing, and the entire system, do you think that those inequities are given any credit, or is, the phrase is justice is blind? Is in this sense justice really blind to even the inequities people are facing outside of the system?
It's a great question, and it's exactly, Arjun, why I ran for DA. I think my role, the district attorney, there are only 11 of us in Massachusetts. We have almost complete autonomy, right? We report just to the voters. Even the governor has the legislature that could battle him, with a veto or whatever else. I have to watch Schoolhouse Rock to figure out exactly how the legislature battles the governor, but you get it, right? The mayor has the city council, the attorney general, and your DAs, and not the U.S. attorney. Because remember, the U.S. attorney is appointed, and that is, if our U.S. attorney woke up tomorrow and decided to have my policies, before he even put his signature on the first page, there would be a new U.S. attorney in Massachusetts instantly. There's no autonomy there. They are serving at the will of the US Attorney General and President of the United States. So for me, all of the decisions we make deeply impact people's lives. We have the ability to take away your liberty, even if for an hour, right? If you think about Susan Church, the woman that was representing somebody in front of Judge Sinnott, and he was having clearly the worst day of his life and held her in contempt, and she sat in court in contempt for 3 hours. People were, writing to the Globe and losing their mind because Susan Church, who I like very much, spent 3 hours sitting in the bottom of a courthouse and still got to get out and go back home that day. I welcome any of you on this call to come with me to court one day. There are poor people and Black and brown people that lose 3 months of their life without anyone batting an eye because they don't have $500 to pay for bail. They don't have $250 to pay for bail, or they don't have counsel that spent enough time with them to give them a solid defense. So yes, I think when people say justice is blind and we don't look at color, then those should be incredibly large red flags flying up. If you aren't looking at your data, if you aren't aware of the fact that 90% of the juvenile cases that come through Suffolk County, meaning young people that are arrested by the police that are then brought to us, 90% of them, something like that, are Black and brown youth. What does that have to say? Are you telling me white children don't misbehave? Like, I have millions of them in my family on my father's side. They're very misbehaving all over the place, right? But we police where we police, right? I like to tell people, if I sent my 5 Boston police detectives that are in my executive protection unit to follow Shannon and her entire family for a week, we went through your trash, we pulled you over every time you crossed a dotted line, you didn't use your turn signal, we would have your life up in arms in no time as a result of that. Maybe the crimes might not be exactly the same, but underage drinking, child pornography, all tax evasion, there are tons of different crimes that different communities engage in, but the police just aren't looking there. So I think there's a lot of discretion that is used in these roles. And when the role has only ever been filled by one type of person, that is usually the same type of discretion you get. So I'm proud of the fact that there are now women in the role as DA. There are now people of color in the role as DA. And we need even more voices in this role to make sure we are held accountable.
Mark, was there something you wanted to say on that point?
I want to backtrack a little bit to one of the points that DA Rollins made, and it was around the crisis standards of care for how hospitals were going to triage in the event that they were kind of overrun, right? So what these standards were basically, if we don't have enough ventilators for the amount of people that need ventilators, how are we going to make decisions on how to allocate those ventilators? And what DA Rollins talked about was them including what are called comorbidities, or in other words, just pre-existing conditions. And the types of pre-existing conditions that we're going to bump you down in priority for a ventilator are things like heart disease and kidney disease and lung disease, all things that disproportionately impact Black and brown communities. And not because there's anything inherent in our DNA that makes us predisposed to those things, but because of histories of redlining and inadequate access to proper nutrition and inadequate access to preventative medical care, right, which are all political decisions. These were all policy decisions that were made long before I was born. Right? I was born right outside of Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the asthma capital of the country, right, which is outrageous for a little tiny city in Western Massachusetts. And so, I've got a friend that's a doctor that likes to say, kind of his metaphor for this, it's at one point in time, the system's kind of chopped off the leg of any Black and brown person. And now they're saying, oh, well, to get a ventilator, you need to have 2 legs. And so it's this vicious cycle. And so the idea that we can just kind of have, like DA Rollins talked about, this colorblind approach to remedying these situations completely ignores that, the disease, while on its face is quote unquote colorblind, it hasn't impacted us in a color neutral way. And
I
so
love
if
it.
we're not-
And
if we're
one,
not-
Renee, one thing I want to just add to give you a real example of like environmental racism and policies. Chelsea, again, Chelsea. So Chelsea has the Tobin Bridge going directly through it. It has Logan Airport flying planes, every however many minutes directly over it. And it also has the largest private food distribution center in the United States of America in Chelsea. And there might be people that say, oh, that's great. So they can, travel as quickly as they want, whatever. Yeah, maybe. But all of those emissions from those planes, all of that, smog and pollution from that bridge and the cars and the 18-wheelers is why, with Springfield with asthma, COPD, right? Not just Chelsea, right? Think about South Boston, Winthrop, East Boston, all of those impacted towns around the airport. There's a reason why there are heightened levels of COPD in some of the families that live near there. There's a reason why, and I used to be the chief legal counsel at Massport, why we pay for windows that are soundproof for all of those different, neighboring towns and areas. So, but Chelsea didn't have enough people, that were wealthy enough or with time on their hands to go to the State House to say, why don't you put the Tobin Bridge in Winchester, right? Hey, what if you had Logan Airport flying over, Waban, right? Or Wellesley or another W town that rich people live in Massachusetts, right? So for me, those individuals have the time and the resources. They have the lineage of my dad used to be a this or my aunt is the that now I'm proud to say, luckily people get to say Mark Martinez is my uncle or my dad or my brother or my whatever. And I'm going to call him and he's going to help me with this. But Mark, I'm 49 right now. I'm the first person in my family on both sides that is somebody that people feel like they can call. And I was born in 1971. There are, we are generations behind in certain poor communities of all colors. There are people in Charlestown, Southie, West Roxbury even, that don't know anybody that's a state rep or ran for Senate or did something else. But that's changing, which is exciting.
We have time for one sort of last quick round robin, and I want to get everybody's closing thoughts on what you want the students to come away with. Obviously, the pandemic is altering attitudes and perceptions of the law. Whether that gets borne out in actual policy remains to be seen in a long-term sense. But taking that as an idea, Professor Landers, I'll start with you. What do you want our students to walk away with after this?
Well, the last few go-rounds in the conversation have made me think about all of I agree completely with what Rachael and Mark were saying, but I also want to elevate the conversation a little bit. Elections do matter. That was implicit in what Rachael said. Elections do matter, and elections at every level matter. I think that, having social movements and activism is really important because that, helps shift public opinion, but people really have to get out and vote. It actually does matter that whether it's President Obama who's president or President Trump, and not because of either of their particular personal things, but because of the policies. The Tobin Bridge wouldn't be such a big problem for the communities which it traverses if we had decent environmental laws on auto emission standards, gasoline mileage standards, all those things. If we had decent regulation of, how much noise airplanes can make, what are the components of the jet fuel that is also spewing emissions. So those policies at that level make a tremendous difference as well. On the ventilators point, why are we talking, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, why are we talking about shortages of ventilators, right? We don't even really need to be having that conversation if people at the leadership levels in our governments were thinking ahead and creating the stockpiles and then distributing them fairly where the need was. And then they can be redistributed again when the need moves to some other part of the country. So I think that, we don't have to take for granted that we have to decide between the brown person and the white person who gets access to the ventilator. We need more ventilators, people. That's my answer to this.
Shannon, how about you? What do you want our students to walk away with?
Well, I just want to echo what Renee just said on the importance of voting, the importance of bringing new voices into the conversation of making these decisions and thinking about who is benefiting from our policies. Listening to DA Rollins talk about what she has done and bringing an entirely new perspective to her role. The Suffolk County is so fortunate to have her having changed our priorities in law enforcement, and it's very exciting to see these ideas sweeping around the country. I had wanted to talk about, I'll put in just a very quick note also that another issue that my law firm's been working on that I think is also profoundly important today with the reckoning our country is going through on racial issues and police misconduct is who is in our police departments. We have been fighting civil service exams that have kept Black and brown people out of police departments and have kept them out of positions of authority in police departments. We won a case in federal court in Boston in which the court held that the exam that's used in Boston, it's the same exam that's used throughout Massachusetts that is used to promote police officers to positions of power, has a discriminatory racial impact on Black and brown officers. The city of Boston, for everything that it is saying about how we're going to do all we can to fight racism in today's world, is appealing that case. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is continuing to fight us on this issue. I think inclusiveness and perspectives for who is making the laws as well as who is enforcing the laws is critical, and we need to be thinking about those issues as well.
DA Rollins, how about you?
Yeah, so, I want the students to come away with the fact that you don't have to wait don't doubt yourself, and you don't have to wait. And no, you don't have to run for office if you don't want to. I didn't know Mark before this, but unfortunately for you, Mark, I'm going to know you quite a bit now after it. And I'm just so happy to know that we have people like Mark working in our state house, right? Like, I came to this, I was late to the party, but I am, partying right now that I am here, and you don't have to wait. Your voice is very important in this. Elections matter. You need to vote in every election. The census matters, and not just because it's like, oh, I want to be counted. We could pick up another congressional seat, right, in Massachusetts, depending on what our numbers are. That means we could have even more representation and diversity there. I will say, guys, when you talk about your police aren't elected. The mayor is, right? The mayor usually appoints your police commissioner, and don't underestimate the power of shame. I just sent our governor a letter yesterday because Justice Lenk is stepping down from our Supreme Judicial Court. There are 7 justices on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Do you know that when Governor Baker replaces Justice Lenk, he will have appointed 6 of the 7 justices on our SJC? Of these 7 justices, 6 are white, 5 are former prosecutors, and we used to have, 2 people of color, criminal defense lawyers, people that have represented the indigent. The SJC, as well as our appeals court, makes the laws in our state, right? They are deeply important. They review every single first-degree homicide. It is incredibly important that you put your feet to the fire and hold our electeds from every level responsible for what it is you want them to do. And certainly in an election year, because they will do anything to get reelected, right? So as students, you should be asking us to have a forum. You should be asking to host a debate. You should be sending out questionnaires and seeing how people answer those questions, and then holding them accountable for it if you publish or write something or ask the Globe or do something. But don't be limited by what it is people have done in the past. Blow the top off and ask for what you want. All people can say is no.
And Mark, we will close with you. What are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, from the perspective of Beacon Block, what I will say is that, especially for young people, it can be really scary demanding protections in your workplace and demanding to be treated fairly in your workplace, but things aren't going to change unless you do it. You know, me and the group that I'm a part of is taking on one of the oldest institutions in the country, and really taking them to task, and that's scary, but you know, things weren't going to change until someone made them change. And then the other quick thing that I will say as it relates to COVID is I think framing is really important. And I see a lot of people talking about how COVID has showed the failures of all of our systems. But I think it's really clear to point out that these aren't failings. These systems are operating exactly the way that they were designed to operate, to protect those with power and privilege and money at the cost of the life of everybody else. So I don't think that COVID exposed failures. I think it just unmasked a system that a lot of people were blind to. And like DA Rollins said, you know, you don't have to be an elected official to make those things change, but you just have to realize that these systems are set up to work this way, and plug in where you can to disrupt those systems and change those systems.
Well, thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. You know, I'll leave the students with just one thought. I highly encourage everyone to look into the work that our panelists are doing, whether that's Mark over at Beacon Block, Shannon's work over with Workers' Rights, and what District Attorney Rollins is doing in the DA's office. It's fascinating, it's important, and especially also what your own Professor Landers has been working on. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for such a great conversation. And I will turn it now over to Professor Coolidge.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks especially to all of our panelists who have done a fabulous job of unpacking a theme that has been consistent throughout the series, which is that the impact of COVID is not democratic in a small d, it is very unequal, and it is unequal in lots of different ways. I hope you'll all join us next week when we turn from an examination of unequal risk and unequal liability to a discussion about national security writ largely. And we will also be having a conversation about election security. So I hope to see you all back here next week, same time, 4 o'clock on Wednesday.